She was 27, a widow, and down to her last $4 silver. She had no family left to speak of, no plan to follow, and just one small brass-bound folding rule that had belonged to her husband. And, with that $4, she bought a derelict freight car, abandoned on a dead spur line outside of Laramie, Wyoming. The townsmen laughed at her folly. A woman buying a pile of rotting wood and rusted iron. But what nobody knew was that hidden deep within the car's sturdy frame was a secret that would not only silence their laughter, but change her life forever. Settle in and stay close with us. We love to hear where our stories find you, so please, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Ada Mercer had not always been alone. She had come to Wyoming Territory 2 years prior with her husband Thomas, a man whose hands were as clever as his mind was kind. He was a carpenter and a surveyor by trade, a man who believed in the truth of a plumb line and the integrity of a well-set joint. He saw the world in terms of structure and potential, and he had taught Ada to see it the same way. He'd taught her how to read the grain of a piece of pine, how to estimate board feet with a glance, and how to use his 2-foot folding rule not just for measuring, but for understanding the bones of a thing. The rule was a beautiful object, made of boxwood with brass hinges and pins, its markings precise and clear. It had been his father's before him, and he had given it to her on their wedding day. To measure out a good life, he'd said, his smile quiet and sure. They had bought a small parcel of land with their savings, a place with a creek and a stand of cottonwoods, and Thomas had begun to build their home with his own hands while Ada planted a garden and learned the hard rhythms of the high plains. He was a man of few words but deep affections, and in their small, unfinished cabin, Ada had felt more secure than she ever had in her life. But the plains were as unforgiving as they were beautiful, and a fever that swept through the valley that first winter took Thomas from her in the space of a week, leaving her with an unfinished house, a half-plowed field, and a silence that was heavier than any stone. She tried to hold on, to finish the work they had started, but a woman alone was a poor credit risk, and the bank that held the note on their land was not sentimental. The notice of foreclosure was not delivered with anger or malice, but with a quiet administrative finality that was somehow worse. A man in a clean shirt and a dusty bowler hat handed her the papers, his eyes avoiding hers, and told her she had 30 days. She did not weep or plead. Thomas had taught her that dignity was in the work, not in the asking. For those 30 days she worked, harvesting what she could from her garden, mending her clothes, and packing her few possessions into a single trunk. On the last day, she stood in the doorway of the cabin, the wind pulling at the loose strands of her hair. She ran her hand over the door frame Thomas had set, the wood smooth and perfect. She took one last look at the empty space where their life was supposed to have been, and then she closed the door behind her, the sound of the latch clicking into place like the closing of a book. She had sold her wagon and mule for enough money to settle her accounts at the general store and purchase a ticket on a stagecoach to Laramie, a town she knew only by name. She arrived with her trunk, the folding rule in her apron pocket, and less than $5 to her name. She took a room at a boarding house, a small, clean space that smelled of lye soap and loneliness, and began to look for work. But work for a woman was scarce: laundry, mending, cleaning, and it paid barely enough to cover her rent. Each day, her small store of money dwindled, the coins shrinking in her purse until all that remained were 4 heavy silver dollars. It was then that she saw the notice for the sheriff's auction of delinquent properties and abandoned assets. She went not with any real hope, but because she felt she had to do something, to take some action rather than simply wait for her last dollar to be spent. It was an act of defiance against the quiet, creeping despair that threatened to swallow her whole. The auction was held in the dusty square in front of the courthouse, a gathering of men in worn coats and Stetsons, their faces weathered by sun and wind. They were ranchers, merchants, and foremen from the Union Pacific Yard, all looking for a bargain. Ada stood at the edge of the crowd, a small, solitary figure, feeling the weight of their sideways glances. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a stained waistcoat, worked his way through a list of unclaimed freight, broken tools, and a sway-backed horse that looked even more tired than she felt. The bidding was brisk and businesslike. Then, he announced the final item. Lot 27. One B&O boxcar, number 743, currently situated on the abandoned Black Creek spur line. Sold, as is, where is. Removal is the buyer's responsibility. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. The old spur line was a local joke, a failed venture from a decade ago that led 5 miles to a played-out quarry and ended in a tangle of sagebrush. The freight car that sat there was considered less than worthless. It was an eyesore and an obstacle. What am I bid for this fine piece of railroad history? The auctioneer bellowed, a smirk on his face. Shall we start the bidding at $1? A man near the front called out, I'll give you $1 if you haul it away for me. More laughter. Ada, however, was not looking at the broken wheels or the peeling paint described by the auctioneer. She was looking at the faded numbers he had called out. B&O 743. Thomas had once worked for the Baltimore and Ohio line back east, and he had told her stories of the different cars. He'd explained that the older work cars, the ones built to house survey crews or track gangs, were often modified, their interiors customized by the men who lived in them. They were built to be sturdy, self-contained little worlds. While the men around her saw a wreck, Ada saw a structure. She saw seasoned oak timbers and forged iron braces. She saw a roof that, even if it leaked, was still a roof. She saw shelter. A man in a dusty railroad coat stood near her, his arms crossed. He had a stern, quiet face, and he wasn't laughing with the others. He watched her, his gaze sharp and curious. This was Henry Pike, the Union Pacific foreman, a man who knew every spike and tie for 100 miles. He saw her studying not the car's decay, but its form, her expression intent and focused, and he saw something the others missed entirely. $1 bid, the auctioneer said, trying to move things along. Another man shouted, $2. For the firewood. $3. A third man offered, joining the joke. The auctioneer looked around, ready to gavel it down. Do I hear $4? It was then that Ada stepped forward. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady. $4. A sudden silence fell over the crowd. Every head turned to look at her. The laughter died, replaced by a kind of stunned, derisive pity. The auctioneer blinked, genuinely surprised. $4 from the lady. Going once? Going twice? He scanned the crowd of grinning faces. Sold. To the widow Mercer for $4. He banged the gavel, and a fresh wave of chuckles and murmurs spread through the men. Ada ignored them. She walked to the clerk's table, her back straight, and carefully counted out her $4 silver. The clerk handed her the bill of sale, a single sheet of paper that felt as heavy and as final as a gravestone. She folded it, tucked it into her pocket, and turned to walk away from the courthouse, the sound of the men's fading laughter following her like a bitter wind. Her journey was not one of great distance, but it was a passage from one state of being to another. She walked from the center of town, where the buildings stood shoulder to shoulder, out past the livery and the blacksmith's shop, toward the edge of Laramie, where the neat grid of streets dissolved into open country. The town was behind her, a place of judgment and dwindling opportunity. Ahead of her lay the vast, empty expanse of the high plains, the sky a dome of brilliant, indifferent blue. The wind, a constant presence here, pressed against her, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass and the faint, far-off smell of pine from the mountains. She followed the main line of the Union Pacific for a quarter of a mile, the steel rails gleaming in the sun, a symbol of connection to a world that felt impossibly distant. Then she saw it, the rusted switch, the track that veered off and disappeared into the sagebrush. This was the Black Creek Spur. The rails were dull and pitted, the wooden ties were cracked and weathered, some of them half buried in the sandy soil. Weeds grew thick between them. It was a line that went nowhere, a testament to a forgotten ambition. She followed the track as it curved gently away from the main line, the silence broken only by the crunch of her boots on the gravel and the cry of a hawk circling high overhead. After a 10-minute walk, she saw the freight car. It stood alone, looking like some great wounded animal that had come here to die. It was bigger than she had imagined, nearly 40 feet long. Its sides weathered to a silvery gray, streaked with the rust-colored tears of weeping iron bolts. The paint, once a deep oxide red, clung in brittle patches. The large letters B&O and the number 743 were still visible, like faint scars. One of the axles was broken, causing the whole car to list to one side, its door hanging askew from a single hinge. It looked derelict, abandoned, and utterly forlorn. But Ada saw more. She saw the heavy oak beams of the undercarriage, timbers that were still sound despite the years of neglect. She saw the craftsmanship in the iron trusses and the corner plates. It was battered and broken, but it had been built to last. She walked around it slowly, her hand trailing along the rough, sun-warmed wood. She felt a strange sense of kinship with this forgotten object. It, too, was a relic of a past life, cast off and deemed worthless. As she stood there, contemplating the enormous task she had set for herself with her last $4, she heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel behind her. She turned to see the railroad foreman from the auction, Henry Pike. He stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. He was a man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered and weathered, with eyes that had seen too much sun and too many miles of track. He wasn't smiling. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, "that's a lot of firewood for $4. His tone wasn't mocking, but matter-of-fact. Ada met his gaze directly. "I don't intend to burn it," she said. He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the car, taking in the broken axle, the sagging roofline, the general state of decay. He saw what the other men saw, but like her, he also saw the bones beneath. He was a man who understood structure. "Axles snapped clean through," he observed. "Trucks twisted. She ain't rolling anywhere soon." "I don't need her to roll," Ada replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I just need her to stand." Pike looked from the car back to her, and for the first time, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even respect, entered his eyes. He saw the set of her jaw, the lack of fear in her posture. He saw a woman who was not defeated, but assessing. He had seen that look before, in track foremen facing a washout and in engineers nursing a failing locomotive over a high mountain pass. It was the look of someone squaring up to a problem, not running from it. "Well," he said after a long moment, "the frame is sound. That's something." He gave a curt nod, as if confirming a fact to himself, and then turned and walked back toward the main line without another word, leaving Ada alone with her enormous broken $4 home. The air inside the car was thick and stale, smelling of decades of dust, mouse droppings, and the faint, ghostly scent of coal smoke and old wool. Sunlight filtered through the grimy panes of a small window at one end, and through the gaps in the warped planking of the walls, striping the dusty floor with narrow bands of light. Cobwebs, heavy and gray as funeral shrouds, hung from the ceiling beams. The space was cavernous and empty, save for a few remnants of its former life. Against one wall were two sets of built-in wooden bunks, their rough mattresses long since rotted into nests for pack rats. At the far end, a small pot-bellied stove, its iron body red with rust, stood cold and silent. And along the other wall, beneath the grimy window, was a long, sturdy workbench, its surface scarred with the marks of countless projects, saw cuts, oil stains, and the circular ghosts of paint cans. This, Ada knew, was the heart of the car. This was where the work had been done. She set her small bag down and took a deep breath, the dust catching in her throat. The task ahead was overwhelming, but she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. This place was hers. It was broken and dirty and forgotten, but it belonged to her. She had a place to stand, She began with the simple, methodical act of cleaning. She had brought a broom and a bucket with her, purchased with the few cents she had left after buying the car. She opened the one good door as wide as it would go, propping it open with a rock to let in the air and light. She started at one end, sweeping the thick layer of dirt and debris toward the open door. The rhythmic scrape of the bristles on the wood, a comforting, purposeful sound. It was work, and work was something she understood. As she swept, she uncovered the history of the car, layer by layer. She found a rusted railroad spike, a deck of playing cards that had turned to brittle wafers, a tin button from a pair of overalls. Each object was a small echo of the men who had lived and worked here. It took her the better part of the afternoon to sweep the floor clean. The sunlight was slanting low through the open door when she finally finished, her arms aching and her face smudged with dirt. The car was still a wreck, but it was an ordered wreck now. The floor was bare, revealing the solid oak planking, worn smooth in paths between the bunks, the stove, and the workbench. It was then, as she stood surveying her work, that she turned her full attention to the workbench. Thomas had taught her to look closely at how things were made. The story of a thing is in its joints, he used to say. The workbench was made of heavy pine, its top a single, thick slab. But as she ran her hand along its front edge, her fingers traced a fine, almost invisible line in the wood. It was too straight, too perfect to be a crack. She knelt for a closer look. The grain of the wood on the front panel of the bench was slightly different from the wood on the top and sides. It was a subtle thing, something a casual observer would never notice. She pressed on the panel, but it was solid. She tried to find a latch or a handle, but there was nothing. Remembering her husband's folding rule in her pocket, she took it out. The brass felt cool and solid in her hand. She unfolded a section and used it to check the seams of the workbench, measuring the depth, checking for square. Everything was perfect, the craftsmanship impeccable. And yet, that one faint line remained, an intentional disruption in the pattern. She thought about the men who built these cars, men like Thomas, who lived by their wits and their hands. A hiding place would not be obvious. It would be part of the structure itself. She examined the underside of the bench, her fingers exploring the heavy support brackets. Near the right-hand corner, beneath the top slab, her fingers brushed against a small, round indentation in the wood. It was a knothole, but it felt too smooth, too regular. She pressed her thumb into it and felt a faint click. A section of the front panel, about 2 feet long, sprang open a fraction of an inch. Her heart began to beat a little faster. With trembling fingers, she pried the panel open. It was a cleverly concealed door on hidden wooden hinges. Inside, nestled in the dark hollow space, was a flat, rectangular tin box, its surface coated in a thin layer of dust. It was heavy when she lifted it out. She carried it to the doorway, into the fading light of the setting sun, and sat down on the threshold of her new home. The box was not locked, but the lid was sealed tight with wax. She used the edge of her husband's rule to carefully break the seal and pry it open. Inside, wrapped in a sheath of oilcloth to protect them from moisture, was a thick bundle of papers tied with a faded red ribbon. Beneath the papers lay a small, heavy leather pouch. Ada's hands shook slightly as she untied the ribbon and carefully unfolded the documents. The paper was stiff and crackled with age, the ink a faded brown. The first document was a bill of sale, written in an elegant looping script. It recorded the sale of one Baltimore and Ohio work car, number 743, from the railroad to a man named Elias Vance for the sum of $100. The date on the document was 1870, more than a decade ago. Beneath it was a series of official-looking land grants from the United States General Land Office, granting title to Elias Vance for a right-of-way extending 5 miles from the Union Pacific Main Line, along with mineral and timber rights to the adjacent parcels of land. It was the entire Black Creek Spur. There were surveyor's maps, meticulously drawn, detailing the route of the spur line to the quarry. And there were lien papers showing that Mr. Vance had personally financed the construction of the line, placing liens against the land and all associated assets, including, specifically, car number 743 as collateral for his investment. The final document was a single sheet of paper, a legal addendum to the bill of sale for the car. Attached to it was a handwritten letter. Ada unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was the same as on the bill of sale, precise and clear. It read, "To whomever finds this, September 12, 1872. My name is Elias Vance. I was the chief surveyor and the sole financier for the Black Creek Quarry spur line. I believed in this venture. I believed in the quality of the stone in that quarry and in the promise of this territory. I invested all I had in laying this track in the hope of building something that would last. It has become clear to me that my partners in Cheyenne do not share my vision. They are men of speculation, not of construction. They have overextended the company's credit and will soon drive it into bankruptcy to settle their other, more foolish debts. They believe this spur line and this old work car to be worthless assets. They are mistaken. I have consulted with a lawyer. By the terms of our agreement and the liens I hold, all physical assets of the spur line are legally bound together. The land grants, the right-of-way, the rails, the ties, and this car, number 743, are a single, indivisible property. I have legally bundled them as such. Whoever holds the clear title to this car holds the title to it all. I have no heir to leave this to, and I fear I will be ruined along with the company. I am hiding these documents here, in the car where I drew the maps and planned the work, as an act of faith. Perhaps one day, someone with the eyes to see the value in a forgotten thing will come along. Perhaps it will be a person who understands the worth of good work and a solid foundation. I leave this not as a treasure, but as an opportunity. It will require labor to make it worth anything again. The track will need clearing, the quarry will need work. But the right is sound, and the title is clear. In the pouch, you will find $200 in gold coin. It is not much, but it may be enough to make a start. Use it wisely. I hope this finds a good home. I hope the work I started may one day be finished. Sincerely, Elias Vance. Ada read the letter twice, her eyes tracing the careful, deliberate script. The words of this man, this stranger from the past, spoke directly to her own heart. He too had believed in building something, and he too had been defeated by the cold arithmetic of other men's ambitions. She reached into the box and lifted out the leather pouch. It was heavy, and when she loosened the drawstring, the unmistakable gleam of gold coins shone in the twilight. She poured them into her hand. 10 $20 gold pieces. $200. It was a fortune. It was a new beginning. She sat there on the threshold of the broken freight car, the letter in one hand and a fortune in the other, and for the first time since Thomas had died, she wept. They were not tears of sorrow or of self-pity, but tears of profound, aching relief. The sun had set, and a cool breeze was blowing down from the mountains. She carefully folded the letter and the documents, placed them and the coins back in the tin box, and held it close. The laughter of the men in the town square seemed like a distant echo from another lifetime. They had laughed at the foolish widow who had spent her last $4 on a pile of junk. They did not know that she had not bought a wreck, she had bought a future. She had bought the whole damn line. The next morning, Ada rose before the sun, her mind clear and focused. The emotional tide of the previous evening had receded, leaving behind a bedrock of purpose. She knew she could not do this alone. The documents in the tin box were powerful, but they were just paper until they were recognized by the law and backed by knowledge she did not possess. Her first stop was not the courthouse, but the Union Pacific rail yard. She found Henry Pike near the roundhouse, directing a crew that was replacing a damaged coupling on a locomotive. He stood amidst the hiss of steam and the clang of steel, a man entirely in his element. He saw her approaching and walked to meet her, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. His expression was as blunt and guarded as it had been the day before. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat. "Come to sell me that firewood after all?" Ada looked up at him, her gaze steady. "No, Mr. Pike, I've come to ask for your counsel." She held out the tin box. "I would be grateful if you would look at something for me. Something I found in the car." Pike's eyes narrowed with curiosity. He hesitated for a moment, then gestured toward a small shed that served as his office. Inside, the room smelled of strong coffee and metal filings. He cleared a space on a cluttered desk. Ada opened the box and laid out Elias Vance's documents, smoothing the creased paper with her palm. Pike bent over the desk, his initial skepticism giving way to a low whistle of astonishment as he read. He picked up the surveyor's map, his calloused finger tracing the path of the spur line. He read the land grants, his lips moving silently. He understood the language of these papers, the legal and physical reality they represented. When he finally looked up at her, the gruffness was gone from his face, replaced by a look of profound respect. "Good God, woman," he breathed. "You didn't buy a boxcar, you bought a railroad." He explained to her, in his practical, no-nonsense way, what she possessed. The right-of-way was the key. It gave her control of the 5-mile corridor of land, a valuable asset in a territory where land was everything. "You need a lawyer," he said, his mind already working on the problem. "Not one of the fat ones who work for the cattle barons. You need someone young and hungry. Abernathy. He has an office over the Mercantile. He's smart, and the town's establishment hasn't bought him yet." Ada tucked the papers safely back in their box. "Thank you, Mr. Pike. Don't thank me yet," he grumbled, though his eyes held a new warmth. "The paperwork is one thing. Making that line worth a damn is another." Following his advice, Ada went to see Mr. Abernathy. His office was a small, dusty room filled with more books than furniture. He was a young man with a thin mustache and an intense, serious expression. He listened to her story, his face a mask of professional skepticism, but as he examined the documents, his eyes widened. He spent nearly an hour reading, cross-referencing dates, and checking the language of the liens. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, a look of incredulous excitement on his face. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, his voice hushed with awe. This is ironclad. The chain of title is unbroken. The liens are properly filed and were never discharged. The territory's abandonment laws don't apply because the property was never unclaimed, merely dormant. When the sheriff auctioned the car, he unwittingly auctioned the entire attached property. It's the most brilliantly obscure piece of legal maneuvering I have ever seen. Together, they walked to the Laramie County Courthouse. The clerk, a balding man who had been at the auction, smirked when he saw Ada. "Come to file a complaint about that pile of splinters you bought?" he asked. Mr. Abernathy stepped forward and placed the bill of sale and the land grants on the counter. "We've come to file a transfer of title for the Black Creek Spur Line and its associated properties to its new owner, Mrs. Ada Mercer." The clerk's smirk vanished. He stared at the documents, his face paling. He called over his superior. There was a flurry of confused, angry whispering. They checked their own records, their disbelief turning to grudging acceptance. The paperwork was undeniable. An hour later, Ada walked out of the courthouse with freshly stamped and recorded deeds in her name. The news spread through Laramie like a grass fire. The men who had laughed at her were now silent, their mockery replaced by stunned disbelief and a healthy dose of fear. They had laughed at a poor widow. They had not realized they were laughing at the owner of 5 miles of Wyoming. The legal victory was quiet and absolute, but Ada knew it was only the beginning. Ownership on paper meant nothing without the physical reality to back it up. The spur line was still a 5-mile stretch of dereliction, and her home was still a broken-down freight car. The work had to begin. She used $10 of Elias Vance's gold to buy supplies at the general store, heavy work gloves, a new bucket, lye soap, a lantern, oil, and basic provisions. The storekeeper, who had been among the laughers, now treated her with a cautious, deferential respect that she found more satisfying than any apology. Her first task was to make the car habitable. She spent 2 days scrubbing it from top to bottom, washing away the grime of years. The lye soap and hot water stripped away the filth, revealing the clean, honest grain of the wood beneath. She repaired the broken door hinge with a piece of leather and some salvaged nails, so it now closed securely. She carefully cleaned the panes of the small window until the sunlight streamed in, bright and clear. The space began to transform from a derelict shell into a simple, clean shelter. Henry Pike appeared on the third day, unannounced, carrying a heavy toolbox. He set it down without a word and began to inspect the car's undercarriage. "You're sitting on a broken axle," he stated, not unkindly. First big wind, she could tip over. Over the next week, he spent his evenings after his shift at the rail yard helping her. He was a patient, exacting teacher. He showed her how to use heavy jacks to lift the corner of the car, how to block it securely with heavy timbers so it sat level and stable. He brought a replacement bearing from the yard scrap pile and showed her how to heat and set it. He helped her patch the leaking roof with tar and canvas. He spoke little, but his actions were a constant lesson in competence and self-reliance. He taught her the names of tools she'd never seen before: a track wrench, a spike maul, a tamping bar. He showed her how to sight down a rail to check for alignment, how to listen to the ring of a spike being driven to know if it was secure. Under his tutelage, Ada's hands, once accustomed to needle and thread, grew calloused and strong. She learned the satisfying ache of a body used for hard, productive labor. One evening, as they worked on the rusted pot-bellied stove, she asked him why he was helping her. He stopped his work, turning a bolt over in his hands. "My wife," he said. His voice low and rough. She was a smart, capable woman. Built a life for us out of nothing. After she passed, I saw how quick the world is to dismiss a woman on her own. You remind me of her. You see the work that needs doing, and you ain't afraid to do it." It was the most he had ever said about his personal life, and Ada understood it was a profound expression of trust. Their next project was the stove. It was seized with rust, its flue pipe choked with an old bird's nest. They took it apart piece by piece, cleaning each part with wire brushes and oil. For the cracked firebox, they needed a blacksmith. Pike directed her to Silas Croft, an old man with a forge at the edge of town. Croft was a man of even fewer words than Pike, his face permanently grim from years of heat and smoke. He listened to Ada's request, examined the cracked iron piece she brought him, and simply grunted, "Come back tomorrow." When she returned, the piece was perfectly welded, the seam almost invisible. "What do I owe you?" she asked. He waved a dismissive, soot-stained hand. Pike said, "You're good for it. Pay me when you can." The act of kindness, delivered with such gruffness, touched her deeply. That night, for the first time, she lit a fire in the stove. The little car filled with a gentle, radiating warmth, chasing away the chill of the Wyoming night. She sat at her workbench, which she now used as a table, watching the flames dance behind the grate, and felt a profound sense of peace. She was not just surviving, she was building. Word of Ada's project, and of Henry Pike's involvement, had become the main topic of conversation in Laramie. The initial shock and disbelief had given way to a grudging admiration. People were beginning to see what she was doing not as a fluke of legal luck, but as a serious enterprise. The first person to approach her with a business proposition was a rancher named John Corrigan. He was a big, weathered man with a sprawling ranch about 10 miles north of the spur line. He rode out one afternoon, his horse picking its way carefully along the overgrown tracks, and reined in before her freight car. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, tipping his hat. He had a direct, appraising gaze. "I hear you own this line now." "I do," Ada said, stepping out of the car. "I also hear you're aiming to clear it," he went on. "Is that so?" "It is." Corrigan chewed on this for a moment. his eyes scanning the cleared section of track near the car, then the long, sage-choked line stretching into the distance. It costs me a fortune in time and lost weight on my cattle to drive them all the way to the main stockyards in Laramie, he said. If I could load them here, right at the junction with the main line, it would save me 2 days. I'd pay for that convenience. I'd pay well. He was not just making an offer, he was testing her. Ada understood this immediately. The line is 5 miles long, Mr. Corrigan. Clearing it is a big job. I know it, he said, which is why I'm prepared to help. I've got 5 men and a team of mules that are idle between haying and roundup. They could have this track cleared to the quarry in a month. Ada considered his offer. It was more than fair, it was a lifeline. But she would not appear desperate. What are your terms? She asked, her voice even. No charge for the labor, he said. Call it an investment. In return, I get exclusive loading rights at the junction for the first year, at a fair rate we both agree on. After that, we negotiate like any other customer. Ada extended her hand. Mr. Corrigan, you have a deal. The next Monday, Corrigan's men arrived. They were rough, hard-working men who initially seemed unsure what to make of this woman who owned a railroad. But Ada worked alongside them, clearing brush, pulling stubborn weeds, her determination earning their quiet respect. The work was grueling. They tore out thick sagebrush that had grown for years, its roots like iron claws in the dry soil. They shoveled away sand and dirt that had drifted over the tracks. They replaced cracked and rotted ties, using the good timber Elias Vance had known was on the land. Pike showed them how to regrade sections of the trackbed and tamp the ballast for stability. Slowly, painstakingly, the spur line began to re-emerge from the landscape, a thin but determined line of steel and wood. As they worked, others from the town began to appear. One day, Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, arrived in a small cart, bringing a large pot of hot stew and a loaf of fresh bread. A body can't live on hard work alone, she said simply. And from then on, she came twice a week, her practical kindness a welcome reprieve from the hard labor. Silas Croft, the blacksmith, came out to repair the men's tools when they broke, refusing any payment beyond a cup of coffee. Even Mr. Abernathy, the lawyer, would walk out on a Sunday afternoon to check on their progress, marveling at the physical reality of the legal case he had won. Ada's freight car, once a symbol of her poverty, had become the headquarters of a thriving enterprise, a center of activity and purpose. People no longer called her the Widow Mercer in tones of pity. They called her Miss Mercer, the owner of the Black Creek Line, and their voices held the unmistakable ring of respect. The day the last section of track was cleared felt like a quiet celebration. The 5-mile line now ran clean and unbroken from the Union Pacific Main Line to the Old Stone Quarry. The rails, scoured of their rust by the hard work and the passage of a handcart, shone under the autumn sun. John Corrigan's investment had paid off for them both. He brought his first herd of cattle to the junction, and his men built a temporary loading pen. Henry Pike arranged for a Union Pacific switch engine to pull an empty stock car onto the spur, the first locomotive to touch that track in over a decade. Ada stood on the steps of her freight car, which now served as her home and the line's main office, and watched the operation. She had a ledger on her workbench, and in it she made her first official entry, October 14, 1882. 1 car, 50 head of cattle, shipped for John Corrigan. Payment received, $20. It was a small amount, but it was real. It was the sound of her enterprise breathing its first breath. Her freight car was no longer just a shelter. It was a home. The pot-bellied stove kept it warm against the increasingly chilly nights. She had built a small pantry for her supplies and a shelf for her few books. The interior, once a cavern of filth and despair, was now clean, orderly, and filled with the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee. It was small and simple, but it was the first home that was truly hers, built not just with money, but with her own 2 hands. In the evenings, Henry Pike would often walk out from town after his shift. He would sit with her on the steps of the car, sharing a cup of coffee as the stars emerged in the vast, dark sky. They rarely spoke of the past. Instead, they talked of the future. They talked about the quality of the stone in the quarry and whether it could be sold to the railroad for ballast. They talked about extending the line another 10 miles to reach the timber stands in the foothills. He would listen to her ideas, offering practical advice and quiet encouragement. A gentle, unspoken companionship grew between them, forged in the shared language of hard work and mutual respect. One evening, as a light snow began to fall, dusting the plains in a thin layer of white, Ada was sitting alone inside the car. The lantern cast a warm, golden glow on the wooden walls. She had the tin box open on her workbench. She took out Elias Vance's meticulously drawn map of the spur line and spread it out. Next to it, she placed her husband's brass-bound folding rule. The two objects lay side by side, the grand vision of a man she had never met, and the practical tool of the man she had loved and lost. She thought of Thomas, of his belief in good work and solid foundations. He would have loved this car, she thought. He would have admired the craftsmanship of the hidden compartment, and he would have understood, better than anyone, the quiet triumph of turning a derelict thing into something whole and useful again. She looked out her small, clean window at the track stretching away into the snowy darkness. The world had dismissed her as a poor, helpless widow. The men in the town had laughed at her desperation. They saw a woman with nothing, spending her last few dollars on a piece of trash. They could not see the knowledge Thomas had given her. They could not see the foresight of Elias Vance, waiting patiently in a hidden tin box. And they could not see the quiet strength that is forged in loss and solitude. The laughter had long since died, replaced by the rumble of freight cars and the lowing of cattle. Ada Mercer was no longer an object of pity or scorn in Laramie. She was a fixture, a businesswoman whose name was spoken with a measure of awe. The Black Creek spur line was a modest but steady success. After Corrigan's cattle, other ranchers had followed, grateful for the shorter, easier route to market. Ada had even negotiated a small contract with the Union Pacific to haul stone from the quarry for track ballast, just as she and Pike had discussed. Elias Vance's hope was being realized, his work finally completed. She had paid back Silas Croft for his work on the stove, and Mrs. Gable now sold her bread and pies at a small depot Ada had built near the junction. Mr. Abernathy handled her legal affairs, his practice growing alongside her own reputation. She had not just built a business, she had nurtured a small, interconnected community, all of them tied together by 5 miles of steel track. She still lived in the freight car. She had added a small extension for a proper bedroom, the new pine boards smelling clean and sharp, but the car itself remained the heart of her home and her operation. It was a constant reminder of where she had started. It was her $4 castle, her fortress of solitude, the place where her life had turned. On the second anniversary of the auction, she stood in the open doorway of the car, looking out at the land she now knew so well. The evening air was cool and smelled of rain. Henry Pike was walking up the track from town, his familiar, steady gait a comforting sight. In his hand, he carried a small bundle of wildflowers. He had become her partner, not just in business, but in life, their quiet companionship blossoming into a deep and abiding affection. He stopped before her, a rare, gentle smile on his face, and handed her the flowers. "Happy anniversary," he said. She took them, their bright colors a stark contrast to the muted tones of the prairie. "It's not our anniversary," she said, though a smile played on her own lips. "It is," he corrected her gently. "It's the anniversary of the day you bought a railroad. The day I knew my life was about to change." She looked from his face to the track, then back again. The memory of the auction was no longer a sting of humiliation, but a strange and cherished foundation myth. The scorn of the crowd had been the unlikely crucible in which her new life was forged. Ada Mercer was 27 and a widow with $4 to her name when she came to Laramie. She spent it all on a forgotten freight car at the edge of town. It was the best $4 she ever spent. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you found a piece of your own heart in Ada's journey, we hope you'll subscribe and share it with someone who appreciates the power of quiet strength. We're left wondering, what is something that others dismissed, but you saw the hidden value in? Let us know in the comments below. We'll see you next time.